Hello and welcome. This is the adult Sunday school lesson for First Baptist Church Alabaster. This is the Explore the Bible curriculum for July 19, 2020. And the title of the lesson is Living Wisely. We're still in the book of Proverbs, and we're looking at Proverbs chapter 14 this week. We'll begin with the 8th verse, and we'll read through verse 15. I hope you have your copy of the Word of God, and if you will turn it to Proverbs 15, we'll start reading at the 8th verse. The wisdom of the prudent is to discern his way, but the folly of fools is deceiving. Fools mock at the guilt offering, but the upright enjoy acceptance. The heart knows its own bitterness, and no stranger shares its joy. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. Even in laughter the heart may ache, and the end of joy may be grief. The backslider in heart will be filled with the fruit of his ways, and a good man will be filled with the fruit of his ways. The simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. Now be assured, the truths in these verses we are studying this week will prove to be difficult to interpret in contemporary language. Yet these truths are timeless and will prove to be self-evident, I think. We will attempt to interpret each of these proverbial sayings separately rather than attempting to relate them to a single theme. For the ancient Hebrews, wisdom was a very practical thing, not speculative or philosophical. Some have called these sayings rules for living, and they can be incorporated into everyday life. Wisdom, as we are studying it, was never thought of something apart from faith. It was a part of religion or a part of their faith in its everyday expression. So it was day in and day out a part of their faith, and so were these proverbs. We are looking at verses 8 through 15, but we're going to begin with verse 12, because this is probably the most familiar verse among the verses that we are studying. Surely we are familiar with the saying, appearances are deceptive, or appearances can be deceiving. This phrase is very relevant to verse 12 here. There is a way which seems right, but it turns out to be very destructive. Another way to put it is the way that promises pleasure, prosperity, and even success may actually lead to destruction. A very relevant example of the truth stated in verse 12 could be the phenomenon these days that is vaping. Many among our teenage and 20s population are participating in vaping. And this began back in 2015. There was a California-based company called Juul Labs and several smaller companies as well that started making vaping products as an alternative to cigarette smoking. Popular mythology had it that vaporizers like Juul's products was safer than cigarettes, although each Juul pod contained as much tobacco as a whole package of cigarettes, as well as a number of potentially other harmful additives. It's estimated that some 5 million kids in high school and junior high have become addicted to vaping because, as one 13-year-old put it, vaping is considered cool in my group of friends. And back when I was in school, cigarette smoking to some was considered cool. But this way that seemed right. Remember that phrase in the scriptures. But this way that seemed right to so many turned out to be, in the end, the way to death. Up to 2019, it had been found that 2,500 patients had been hospitalized with lung illnesses and other related health problems that can be attributed directly to vaping. Now moving back to verse 8, the truth found in this verse is related to the teaching in verse 12. The wise person who understands his way is one who looked ahead to discern the future consequences of actions that he or she takes this day. And this phrase, or you may recall the phrase, we must count the cost before we attempt to do something. Well, I think that fits here. We must count the cost. Now, in contrast, the folly of fools causes them to err and go down the path that leads to death. Moving on to verse 9, in the King James Version reads, fools make a mock of sin, or make a mock at sin. To illustrate this verse, one might remember the so-called Reason Rally held in Washington, D.C. in March of 2012. This is where the atheist Richard Dawkins challenged the crowd to ridicule and show contempt for the religious and their doctrines. One observer who attended this so-called Reason Rally wondered this: since this was a rally for reason, why didn't Dawkins urge the crowd to reason with people of faith rather than engaging in lowly ridicule? That certainly is a valued or a very good question to ask. Now let's jump to 2020. We continue to see large groups who want nothing to do with reason and seem to be caught up in emotion as they destroy monuments while others destroy small businesses through burning and looting, while still others chant for the abolishment of police forces, opting for chaos rather than law and order in the streets. Surely, upon observing God's creation, we can see that God is a God of order, and Satan is one who loves chaos. Let's continue and look at verse 10. A person's inmost feelings are usually not known to others. Our hidden sorrows are often covered by a false display of happiness. In other words, we fake it, or we or use an attitude that may be fake just to cover up someone else knowing that we may be sad or whatever. And this can be true of things in which we take pleasure in as well. We can be sure and assured that God knows us entirely, even our innermost thoughts. Let's be reminded of Proverbs chapter 16, verse 2. All the ways of a man are pure in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the spirit. And then in Proverbs 24, verse 12, if you say, behold, we do not know this, does he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who keeps watch over your soul know it? In other words, God knows you. He created you, and you cannot hide anything, your feelings even, from God. Moving on to verse 11. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. And this is a reading from the Revised Standard Version. The literal Hebrew meaning of will flourish is will send forth buds. You ever notice the buds on a rose bush or any other plant in the springtime? It's springing out. There's life there. This reveals an atmosphere of vitality and productivity in the household where the Lord is honored. Have you ever thought about how the Lord is honored in your home? Think about that. How is the Lord honored in your home? Let's move to verse 13. We are told of a familiar experience of the mingling of sorrow and joy. Even times of joy can elicit hidden sorrows. Think about a family Christmas dinner. sometimes bring forth reminders of loved ones who are no longer with us. But we remember the good times we spent in the past. Even funerals can sometimes prompt us to remember humorous experiences that involved the deceased. So good memories are precious. Looking at verse 14. The truth in this verse is closely related to the saying, we reap what we sow. The backslider in heart is translated a perverse man in the Revised Standard Version. This verse refers to a person who willfully does what he or she desires, realizing that it is wrong. In other words, they don't care if what they do is wrong. Their own selfish desire takes priority. Saying again, I've once said about your wanter, W-A-N-T-E-R, your wanter. Sometimes we need to take a look at that, and does that need attention, and does that need to be adjusted or fixed? Proverbs 14, verse 15, contrasts the credulous fool who is easily deceived with a discerning person who knows where he is going. It usually is quite obvious to tell a follower of Christ from someone who refuses to recognize God. Now, is your life lived in a way that others know you belong to God? Years ago, I heard an illustration, and I never have forgotten it. It's about an elderly lady who goes to church every Sunday. This elderly lady is blind and deaf, but she always sits in her spot or her pew at church every Sunday. And one day, a young person asked her, why in the world do you come to church? You can't hear the pastor, you can't see him, you can't hear anybody. And she expressed, I just want everyone to know whose side I'm on. A question that I want you to think about. I want you to compare your life to a house. You know, a lot of us have looked at a house and bought a house, and we look it over before we purchase it. But what condition is your house in? Would you think it, or would you describe it as having a good foundation, but it has tacky additions to it? Would you describe your house as having a fancy exterior, but a shabby interior? Or maybe it's underpriced fixer-upper. Is it well lived in? Is your house ready for resale? Or could it be described a bargain at any price? So compare your house to life. What condition is it in? Well, I hope this lesson has been helpful to you. I hope it's been an encouragement. I would encourage you to go back and read these verses in Proverbs chapter 14 again, meditate upon them, and may want to read your own commentaries on some of the verses. Many of us are finding ourselves in a state of anxiety and worry these days, but the scriptures continue to tell us not to be anxious for anything. Some of us may wonder what God is doing in these days. And some of us may be asking God directly, what are you doing? God most likely is not going to tell you or me what he's specifically doing. What's important in times like this, or any time really, is that God will reveal to you who he is. He is a miracle-working God, and are you surrendered to him? My prayer is that you will experience the peace of Christ today and the days ahead.